pleased that David Williamson has come tonight to talk about Bath Between the Wars. David used to be the head of history at Highgate and came to Bath well over 10 years ago. He's written books on international affairs, and I think coming to Bath probably raised a question in his mind. Well, you know, I write, this is David, more about 20th century history with a particular interest in German history. How did that affect Bath? Hence, I think he wrote the book. So without further ado, can I hand over to you, David Williamson.
Thank you. Very nice to meet you. Now, may I, just before I start, get the hard sell out of the way that Mr. Chandler has got copies of several copies of my book and other books that have a bearing on Bath downstairs, and big bargain for my book. Instead of £18, it's £15, and he also has a card machine, so, you know, no excuse for not buying the book. Now, I'm looking at Bath in the interwar years, and I'll be talking about these years, but also from time to time showing slides. Now, in October 1918, there was no clue really that the war was going to end soon. Lord Bath, whose brother had that same month in October been killed on the Western Front, warned Bathonians that the German army was not yet beaten and still fighting well. And so it seemed, really. And therefore, right up to 11 o'clock on the 11th of November, 1918, people from Bath, as people from all over Europe, were still being killed. There were several cases of Bath men being killed just hours before the armistice. By early November, however, though rumours were circulating that despite absolute secrecy in the railway carriage in Compiègne, where the armistice negotiations were taking place, rumours were circulating that the war was coming to an end. And a nurse in the Bath War Hospital in Coombe Park, Catherine Ainsworth, in a letter to her mother, wrote, "It's Sunday morning. I've just heard the first cock crow, and the clock says 5 to 4. Perhaps it be one of the most momentous Sundays in history." Now, as we know, the armistice was signed the following day, on the Monday, and in Bath, as elsewhere, except, of course, not in Germany, but elsewhere, there was enormous cheers and shouts, church bells rang, and one of the most moving comments I found about those celebrations came from Henry Whitmore, the son of a farmer in Swainswick, who was potato harvesting, and he heard the bells from the city down in the valley ringing, and he knew what had happened, and he said that right up to the 1980s, when he was unable to do so, he would always go to that field on the 11th of November and remember the events. Now, you're probably wondering who this strange character is, and it's from a diary by Sergeant Stanley Sylvester in the RAF. Now, he raided German positions at Charleroi at 2 a.m. on the 11th of November, 1918, and this is his diary. He drew that, and it's intriguing to think, you know, just hours away from the armistice. Now, he later, he lived, fortunately, he later, just a few months later, joined the local income tax department, and he rejoined the RAF in 1939. Now, somewhat flippantly, one could perhaps observe that it's very good training for a tax inspector to lob bombs on the unsuspecting. Now, just as the Hun, as he was commonly called, was put back in his box in November 1918, there was another ruthless enemy, Spanish flu. Now, I tend to speak fairly briefly, but more about how it impacted on schools, because it's better documented, and the schools could also be more closely monitored and controlled by the medical authorities. So I'll just move on to rather a dreary account of the influenza epidemic by the school's medical officer, early 1919, and it's a part of his medical report for the whole of the year 1918. Now, initially, in July, the schools were closed for a short time, all the schools, all the elementary schools in Bath, and that seemed to, amongst children, control the virus. But then by October, it was clear that this was not working. Once again, the schools were closed. And finally, it was estimated in early November that 39 teachers and about 2,500 children had been affected with the Spanish flu. The number of children who died during this period up to the 10th of November was 9. Now, of course, school closures could control the virus, rather as a ghastly lockdown purported to control COVID. But outside in the adult world, which was locked in a total war, it would have been unthinkable to introduce anything like a lockdown. What the acting medical officer of health was able to do was, thanks to the public health influenza regulations of 1918, he could ensure that cinemas and other places of entertainment, after 3 hours entertainment, would have half an hour closed where the premises would be thoroughly cleansed and disinfected. That was the only powers he'd got. Now, of course, on all sides, advertisements in buses, advertisements in factories and in papers were warning people to be careful. But until I look at such an advertisement, I just want to, this is a cutting from a paper. It's Mr. Austin, who was also in the RAF. He returned for 4 days leave and contracted flu, very, very high temperature. He had to go into the war hospital and cool down. And at the time of this report, 19th of October, he still had a very high temperature. Fortunately, he survived. He was the owner and the principal of the typewriter bureau and commercial school. And there are plenty of reports over the next 20 years of him active in the school, so he more than survived. But it's a very typical example of course, what happened to the lucky people who survived. But coming back to the various advertisements, sort of screeching advice about one to be careful and disinfect oneself and everything else, this was a typical example. You see, Lifebuoy soap, and notice that, they get in the influenza scourge. And as one columnist in the Bath Chronicle wrote, a lady called Margaret Osborne, she observed that to keep warm, to eat good food, and to avoid overcrowding would be easy enough for a good many of us in peacetime. But with rationed food, with rationed fuel, and with trains and omnibuses full to bursting point, we might as well ask for the moon. And that was really the situation. So by the end of January, the virus was in retreat, and there were only 7 deaths from influenza in that month. Now, altogether, in November, there were 121 deaths. These are adults. And then a month later, there were further 22 deaths. So I looked up the people who died in Baines from COVID, and figures 2024, that was 474. So it does seem that there were less people who died from the Spanish flu, but not everybody, of course, who died was registered as a victim of Spanish flu, and well into the new year, people contracted it and died. There was a much respected verger in St Luke's parish church on the Wellsway who died in March. There was a farmer out Barthampton Way who died a bit later. So there are all sorts of deaths that were unchronicled. Now, while this was going on, demobilization was a major problem. Clearly, everybody in the forces wanted to get home, and the authorities produced the most incredibly complicated process. The land agent on Lord Temple's estate at Newton St Low observed, when dealing with the estate workers' demobilization applications, if all that performance applies to every man in the army, most of them will die before they get home. And that was, in a sense, it was only quite serious strikes, if not revolts in the army in Calais, London, Folkestone, and elsewhere that forced the government's hand. And even so, the older men on the Western Front got home, but even so, many of the younger men, and also some of the older ones, had the misfortune then to be posted to Mesopotamia, Iraq, to India, and above all, to Russia, to Murmansk, to the Arctic North. Also, of course, there was the whole tragic story of the missing, that as late as the autumn of 1920, a War Office mission was active on the Western Front, trying to find bodies, trying to find missing people. Parents, wives, of course, hoped against hope that their loved one had lost his memory or was perhaps wandering around France or Germany as a tramp. And for instance, one poor lady, Mrs. Stafford of Parkview, Lower Bristol Road, was only informed by the War Office that her husband, a former employee of Stoddard and Pitts, was missing, was dead, and he'd been missing since April 1918. So there were a lot of these cases, tragic little notes in papers, asking returned soldiers if they knew about somebody, promising them an award if they could help. So there was all that, you see. Now, let's move on. This shows troops being demobilized from the Rhineland, because after the armistice, the Second Army moved into the Rhineland. A bit later, the battalion of the Somerset Light Infantry occupied Durham, which is a bit south of Cologne. These are men coming home in April, some of the lucky ones, of course. I'm sure there's the odd Barthonian amongst them. The famous surgeon Forbes Fraser was actually the chief consulting surgeon of the Second Army, which was occupying the Rhineland, the British zone in the Rhineland. So there was a direct link in that way. Now, of course, the unlucky men, this is, I'm afraid, very poor quality, it's from the newspaper, but these are British troops, I think mainly engineers, up in northern Russia. And they were originally sent there to stop weapons that had been sent to help the Russians before the revolution falling into the hands of the Germans and then into the hands of the Bolsheviks. And they were there for over a year. And one man, Sapper Broad, who was a house decorator from Bath, spent a year in Murmansk, with the Royal Engineers, and he complained bitterly of the intense cold and the food served to him by the navvy, which was more like pig's food than anything else. But he was awestruck by the sight of the aurora borealis. So if we move on to, finally when the soldiers get home, what sort of world really awaited them? And what were the post-war challenges? There's a marvelous advertisement that appeared every week in the Bath Chronicle from Stone's the opticians in the corridor. Surely rivals later Specsavers advertisements. And in a prominent space in the Chronicle, it proclaimed that at a time when there were troubles everywhere, there is nothing so valuable or so indispensable as a clear vision, a sentiment in which Lord Arley would surely concur. Now, what were these troubles? There was communism at home and abroad. The Red Army had ousted the Poles from the Ukraine and advanced right up to Warsaw, and they threatened to advance to the German border, and if they reached the German border, the whole of the Versailles peace structure would have collapsed. And the Poles defeated the Red Army outside Warsaw in what the British ambassador called the 12th most famous battle of the world. But interestingly, the trades unions set up councils of action in Britain that prevented supplying war materials to the Poles. The dockers struck, the railwaymen struck, and in Bath there was a council of action, and a representative of this council of action went up to London to confer with the TUC. But that passed over. The Battle of Warsaw saved Europe, really, from Bolshevism. Now, Bolshevism was, of course, a terrible fear for property owners, and also very many sort of right-wing, would we say, the Blue Wall voters. Terrifying stories came out of atrocities in Russia, many of them true. Of course, atrocities were also committed by whites, but there was a terrible sort of fear of Bolshevism. And of course, there were some, including one of the Labour candidates in one of the general elections in the early 20s, who was convinced that Russia was the promised land. And he quoted marvelous pictures of, how in the medical profession, nurses and doctors and cleaners and everybody would have the most marvelous holidays together. But this was one of the great fears. And the other area of course, of concern was the state of Germany. The German economy was suffering from inflation, Germany being the great economic motor of Europe. It was suffering from ruthless French pressure to exploit every loophole in the Treaty of Versailles, which culminated in the Ruhr occupation of 1923, when the French and the Belgians occupied the Ruhr, which was, strictly speaking, an act of war. We adopted an attitude of benevolent passivity, and the Times wrote that something had happened. I think it was on the 7th of January 1923 that was as important as the events of August 1914, which led to the First World War. But fortunately, through American intervention a year later, that particular crisis was solved. Now at home, you had economic problems. After the brief post-war boom, the economy collapses. This results in drastic cuts and labour unrest, culminating in the general strike of May 1926. So I'll just go on here. Now, generally speaking in Bath, the general strike was peaceful, as in most places in the country, but as in most places in the country, there were exceptions. The general strike was called to support the coal miners in May 1926. And in Bath, some 3,000 workers went on strike. It was, to quote the diarist of the Chronicle, the long-awaited thunderstorm, because labour relations had been very tense. There had been strikes from 1919 through to 26, threats of general strikes, fears of revolution. And the general strike was, in a sense, the thunderstorm. Maybe it pierced the boil, whatever cliche one wants to use. Now, apart from a few incidents like this one, the general strike passed over fairly peacefully. It only lasted about a week in Bath. But this particular example, this bus had come down from the Wells Way, and it was driven by a blackleg driver. And the strikers, both from the Bath tramways and no doubt assisted by other strikers, actually took a taxi up. Very interesting. The paper says actually they took a taxi up to the Devonshire buildings, boarded this bus, sat as passengers. Then when it came down near to the old bridge, the bottom of Wells Road, there was a barricade of strikers, and they hauled the unfortunate driver out. He survived. He wasn't beaten up, but he was hauled out, none too gently. But interesting, you only needed a couple of police constables to come along, and the whole crisis evaporated. And that afternoon, the driver was out driving another bus. So generally, the long-awaited thunderstorm in Bath passed off fairly peacefully, but there were, signs of tension like that. And then in Bristol, a frigate was moored in the Cumberland Basin, which was a sign that conceivably the authorities feared that the situation might escalate. After the strike, the coal strike continued on to November. There was in Radstock, there was an attempt to blow up the Norton Hill Colliery, which was right in the centre of the town, which failed. But by November, the miners had no option but to go back to work. They themselves were very bitter about the TUC, which deserted them after a week. But they were, as in 1984, in effect, sort of driven back to work by economic circumstances stronger than they. Now, while this was going on in the UK, on the continent, things were improving. After the Ruhr crisis, if you like, was also a thunderstorm. America intervened with the Dawes Plan, which produced a compromise over reparations. This led to improved Franco-German relations. Germany joined the League of Nations in 1926. And by 1928, you've got a sort of time a bit like this, the very optimistic American-Japanese professor, Professor Fuyukama, said in the 1990s, we've reached the end of history. There's going to be no more drama. Everybody's going to live civilized, liberal lives, no more wars, nothing, you see. And so you could not, he wasn't even alive, nobody said that then, but you could almost say that perhaps we'd reached such a time. Now that just was a meeting on Saw Close of the strikers, actually a very peaceful meeting chaired by the mayor, and it was more a discussion than than an angry meeting. Now here, this is what I've got on to talk about. You see, this is 1927, and for the first time since before the war, German students came to Bath and were welcomed by their English counterparts. And this is the headlines, you see, in the Chronicle. They were welcomed by the Mayoress, Sarah Grand, and, you know, they were delighted with the visit, etc., you see. And Sarah Grand said that the more the young people of the two countries saw of each other, the better they would grow to like each other, which may well be true, but unfortunately, as events unfold, they were prevented from doing that. I'm thinking of the 1930s. Now then, the next slide is perhaps, you know, what triggered thoughts about Professor Fukuyama. This is the Kellogg-Briand Pact, 1928, and it was proposed by the American Secretary of State, Mr. Kellogg, and it was a marvelous idea of outlawing war. You can see the headlines, you see war would become a hoary iniquity. No more war. It was the high point of late 1920s optimism. And again in Bath, as elsewhere, it was greeted with enthusiasm. There was a Thanksgiving service in the Argyle Church. So now, roughly midway between, I've scooted over very quickly, the 1920s. Now, at this point, really, I just want to stop and ask, what sort of place was Bath between the wars? I can't really escape that question. The Germans have this very irritating habit of saying was heißt something, which scares me stiff. You know, it's what is the philosophical, what is the essence of Bath, you see. Well, I suppose it was obviously a national treasure with its great architecture and perhaps an international treasure, as it still is. It was a spa and medical resort. Alderman Chivers, in his inaugural speech on becoming mayor in November 22, declared that there were more rheumatic patients in Bath than any other place in the world. It was also a sporting centre, horse racing, cricket, rugby, etc. And it was a tourist and conference centre and arguably a beacon of culture. See, so let's have a look at some slides exploring these points. Now, this is quite a well-known advertisement. I think it must be round about 1918, and it's enticing English rheumatic people suffering from rheumatic illnesses to Bath, because Wiesbaden and all the foreign spas are closed, and Bath capitalized on that for the first few years after the war. Now, talking about great sporting centre, one of the interesting things was the girls' football team. It was formed in 1920, and it played a series of brilliant charity matches all over England, and the money would go to, of course, charities. St Dunstan's Home for Blind Military Veterans, for example, received money. Unfortunately, the Football Association ruled in 1922 that they couldn't play on FA grounds, probably because they were jealous of the crowds that the girls, not just these girls, there were a lot of girls' football teams, the most famous being in Preston, Lancashire. They're probably jealous of the amount of attention that they received. Now, talking about Bath trying to attract tourists, the Bath Attractions Week was a one-off, and it was an attempt to sell Bath as the, the great shopping centre of the southwest. similarly, 1924, the Empire exhibition in Wembley, Bath had its own very small pavilion. It was not much more than a kiosk, but by all accounts, very well designed. And it claimed, as you can see, to be the premier spa of the empire, which perhaps it was. And then, of course, particularly in the 30s, there were a series of, I thought, rather interesting festivals, art festivals. That's just the cover of one in 1930. And this, I think, is rather interesting, the inside, what was really going on. And it seems to me that there's a marvelous mixture of cutting edge, rather, nowadays, rather dubious character, sort of Gill is somewhere there, Epstein, but also with more traditional people like Munnings, who was marvelous, could draw horses marvelously, and then people, humorous art, people like Heath Robinson. And I must say, I would love an exhibition like that today in Bath. Then, just, this was not part of the festival, but just reminder that there were usually, every month, some quite famous artists, musicians, and indeed speakers who would come down to Bath. This is Paul Robeson coming down. He lived in London at the time, but he was a regular visitor to Bath. He was, of course, a well-known radical. It's just, just shows that Bath did have some very interesting people. It wasn't, it's got a stuffy image, but actually if you look at the sort of talks you could go to, it was remarkably enlightened. This is the great proposal for the Bath Festival of 1939. Now that's simply a draft program. In fact, the draft first page, I don't think they ever got round to devising the program. They had great difficulty in raising the money. They got very influential backers in London, people like Gielgud, Norman Hartnell, the fashion designer, Sidney Bernstein, who founded the Granada Cinema chain. They had very influential backers, and they got round to setting up a committee chaired by the mayor, but they couldn't raise the money in Bath or Bristol or in London. Then the war intervened, and the rest is history, so to speak. But they were trying to rival Salzburg. That was the aim. Now, this is very interesting because I've been trying to show that Bath, was a great tourist centre, a great cultural centre. Its existence really was tied up with bringing people in. Now, in 1928, there was a typhoid outbreak in Bathwick, and it was handled very badly. The initial attempt was to muzzle the press, keep it quiet. 5 people died and about 32 people caught typhoid. And of course, Bathwick was very an area of where very influential and powerful Bathonians lived. And so the council was given a lot of stick, quite rightly. And in June, it attempted to actually muzzle the press. The Morning Post sent a correspondent down to try and find out what was going on, a sign that Bath was of national importance. And, he sniffed out what was going on. Then he was summoned to meet the town clerk and harangued and told that he was not just letting Bath down, but the whole country and the whole empire. And that, it was vital to keep this quiet and keep the economy going. And they actually, where possible, sent out people from the town hall to buy up copies of the Morning Post. But of course, obviously it leaked out. And the council had to but it's interesting. There is an article in one of the Bath history periodicals about it. It's a very interesting incident. So now, so far I've probably tried to show that Bath was a very interesting cultural centre as well as being a health centre. Now there are dissenting views that this is a view from a metro intellectual. Clifford Ellis, the dynamic new headmaster of the Bath School of Art, and he was unimpressed by these festivals and Bath's cultural claims, and cuttingly, arguably unfairly, observed that it's important to realise that Bath is not the artistic city one might imagine, but merely a provincial town with an unimaginatively conservative outlook. So that is a kick in the teeth for Bath. Now, up to a point, of course, he's right. I was just reading the other day that John Betjeman's landlady in Macaulay Buildings told him that she would rather see a village freak show than modern art. So there were plenty of people like that in Bath, as all over the country, and still are, no doubt. Now, Ellis may also have been thinking about Bath as a city for genteel retirement, for retired members of the Raj, spinster ladies, and decayed gentlefolk, who regarded a place in Partis College as the equivalent of having won the lottery. Now that existed, of course, as we know, but it was also an industrial centre with such industries as Stoddard and Pitt, Bath paper mills, the Fuller's Earthworks, Bath cabinet makers, Horseman's, etc. So let's just have a look at these. You see, now that's the famous, at its peak, it employed 2,000 people, and it exported these enormous great cranes all over the world, not just to the Empire, but to South America. Then this is the Fuller's Earthworks. That didn't employ so many. I think it only employed about 20 or 30. But it was quite an active industry in Bath. And Horseman's cars, which sadly never made mass production, as one employer said, Sidney Horseman was a brilliant engineer and inventor, but a terrible organizer. And like Lazarus, the firm kept being bailed out. In the end, in 29, it switched over to designing suspension for tanks and military vehicles. And this did really well, that even the Russians adapted them, apparently, and the famous Russian tanks in the Second World War relied on these. Of course, the Russians didn't pay any money, or ignored the patent. But very interestingly, there were the arguments about patents with Vickers Armstrong and Krupps. And the argument with Krupps went on way beyond September 1939, quite extraordinary. In November, December 39, there's still correspondence with Krupps. In the end, somebody said, well, don't worry, we just got to see what happens in the war. Maybe you won't have to pay Krupps anything. So one of the, I don't know whether it's quite accurate to say, one of the consequences of industrialization was slums. Perhaps it's not accurate because there were plenty of slums before industrialization. But this is if you like, the underbelly of Bath. This is Milk Street. And as Pevsner said, it's within rubbing distance of the industrial area along the river. Now, the industrial Bath, of course, was serviced by workers who developed their own culture. They had their own political party, the Labour Party. They had about 9 councillors on the council of, I think it was about 53 members. They had the Workers' Education Association, the Co-op, the Bath Trade and Workers Association. So there was a working class culture which clashed, of course, with the other cultures in Bath. And this was brought out by somebody that the Chronicle calls a versatile epistolarian. And he wrote to the Chronicle, and he said, his name was Ernest Crawford, and he said, think of all the persons employed in the engineering works, corset works, cabinet works, soap works, cloth works, etc. Also the tradesmen and the outlying districts who only do a local trade in their shops. To most of these, a visitor in central Bath is about as welcome as a bum bailiff in a dwelling house. Now, interesting idea. He was, of course, a contrarian. Maybe we should consider what the medical officer in Bath, Dr. Blackett, said about Bath. He said the population was large enough and sufficiently varied in character and occupation to form a good cross-section of the whole country, the population being 69,000. So now, unfortunately, the end of history ends with the Great Depression, which impacted on Bath, that in April 1932, there were 2,700 unemployed in the city, 3,600 in the whole area, including the rural district council. The council attempted to find work. Pennyquick Cemetery is an example of it. There were charitable efforts by organizations like the Good Neighbours Club. There was a dear old lady called Mrs. Gollidge who ran a sweet and tobacco shop known as the Better Ole in Hampton Row, and she started a shilling fund for the local unemployed in the weeks before Christmas 32, and managed to raise £10 11 shillings, which of course is, heaven knows how much, £500 today, God knows what, perhaps more. Now, it was really, though, the building boom in Bath that created work and brought in people from Radstock, the coalfields, and from South Wales. And this was not popular with local workers because they feared that the work was being taken from them. But I've got a few slides showing, very well-known pictures of the 1930s new buildings. That, incidentally, of course, is one of the hunger marches. It's 1936 that would regularly, almost each year, there were 1 or 2 hunger marches going through Bath. One of the problems was that Bath had to, for the night usually, house and feed them. That caused certain rucks for the council. In 1936, 500 of these men were given bunks in the drill hall in the Upper Bristol Road, and the overflow went to the mission hall I just have to look where they went. Bristol Road. Okay, that's it. Sorry, I won't. Milk Street Mission Hall, Milk Street Mission, found them there, the Milk Street Mission. Now, when we get on, you see, to the big building site, that's the demolition of the old Bath Institute, of course, and the creation of Bog Island, that created work. This was the new electricity showrooms, the corner of Dorchester Street, Southgate Street, Dorchester Street, which the Chronicle calls excitingly modern, and it's rather lovely 1930s style. The flats, Kingsmead Flats, which I always think rival anything produced by Weimar Germany. They were given a makeover in 1992, And that, of course, is the Forum. That's, of course, just a shot taken by me. And then one shouldn't forget, of course, the new hospital, the RUH, and the new school at Beach and Cliff. So there were a lot of big building sites which created work. One of the, of course, one of the consequences of the slump of the Great Depression of 31, 33 was the creation of the black shirts, and the black shirts did have an office in Bath, and from time to time various black shirt leaders would, usually on the way to Bristol, would pass through Bath. And this is a headline about a man called Risdon, who was actually a Bathonian. He was in charge of propaganda with the black shirts, and he gave the Guildhall to quite a packed house a talk about what the BUF, the British Union of Fascists, stood for. But by and large, this lot of fascism didn't make many inroads into Bath. We come to another lot in 1939 fairly soon. So now, just before we return to the international situation, I just want to ask a sort of rhetorical question about how did Bath face the challenges of modernity? And, you know, by that, I mean challenges of the old certainties of religion, patriotism, deference, and even masculinity were disappearing. And just one rather interesting little snapshot I think is worth mentioning is that Mavis Tate, the Conservative MP for Frome, was reported by the Daily, there was an article about her in the Daily Express, and apparently her father told her firmly that it was a woman's business to marry, not to work. And the Express commented, Mrs. Tate has done both. Perhaps another little snapshot of, if you like, you know, emerging equality of sexes is from the Winsley Sanatorium in March 1938. The men normally produce the monthly magazine for the inmates. In March 38, the women were allowed to do it, and they did it so well that the Chronicle commented that the men better, you know, better do better, otherwise they will be replaced. So, of course, Bath was witnessed motorization, discussions even about airport and Claverdon Down, and the schools, of course, and the public experienced the enormous revolution of the radio. So all that aspect, you know, contributed to the modernization and perhaps even the globalization of Bath. See, so that's, I think, Southgate Street. And as far as I can see, I can't really see a horse there. That's 38. So motorization had really transformed the streets. Now we come on to one of the great schemes for modernizing Bath that never happened. And this was Alderman Will's grandiose schemes for extending Milsom Street right up, plunging through Alfred Buildings, right up to the assembly rooms. And this is a picture of it. It's, I suppose, a little bit like the modernization of Regent Street in London in the 1920s. But such was the opposition that it had to be ditched. And it's refreshing to see how public opinion could react on that. And Wills, who, if one wanted to find somebody who could be characterized as Bath's answer to Mussolini, had to give up these plans. But the not only was there this great widening of it, Bond Street was going to be widened, and the island site was going to be demolished in Bond Street. So while these shenanigans were going on in Bath, the global situation, of course, was getting ever darker. That the Liberal candidate, prospective parliamentary Liberal candidate, described the situation in August 1937. He said, "We are in a vicious circle of international trouble, which began in Manchuria, wended its way to Abyssinia and Spain, and is now back at the point of the circle where it began, China." He's referring to Japanese invasion of China. Now, interestingly, he doesn't even mention Hitler. And Hitler was regarded partly as a joke by many people in Bath. There were reports about a Hitler dive at the swimming bath, where presumably, you know, you sort of seek Heiled before you dive down. But there were, very soon it was clear he wasn't a joke. The Whitcomb working men's section, for instance, was addressed by a German socialist in April 1933 who had to be anonymous for security reasons. And in 1936, that's Alderman Wills that I was talking about, and that is, we know whom it is. Incidentally, the owner of that paper was a convinced Nazi, and after his daughter was born, he rushed back home, woke up the whole house shouting, "A new child for the Reich is born." And he was the only man I knew who had a study who would not allow women to enter. So it's intriguing. He died a long time ago. Now, this is the man, Bath's, I don't know about only communists, but one of Bath's few communists. And he went across to Germany to follow a trial of German socialists who'd been arrested. He, in his turn, was apprehended by the Gestapo and interrogated for 5 hours despite the presence of the British consul. And in what strikes me as very Bertie Woosterish way, he kept saying, "Come on, we must have fair play," to the Gestapo agents. But in the end, he was allowed to go across the border to Belgium. It's possible they mixed him up with an MP who had the same name, a British Labour MP. But he's a remarkable man. He appears in all the demonstrations in Bath, anti-war demonstrations initially, then urging help for Spain, etc. And even in the 1950s, he was campaigning on behalf of the Chinese communists in Malaya. So very interesting man. Now, the wars in Bath, the wars in Spain, Abyssinia, and China, of course, were the most part noises off. But Bathonians did fight in Spain, and there were various Bathonian medical people who were active in Abyssinia. But, of course, the fact then that the most famous refugee in Britain in the 30s, the Emperor Haile Selassie, came to Bath, meant that there was particular interest in Abyssinia. And the Abyssinian Association, which was founded nationally to raise money for Haile Selassie so that he could continue to pay diplomats in Cairo and Paris, Washington, was very strong in Bath. Now, he was a glamorous refugee, the most glamorous refugee. There were, of course, many less glamorous refugees. There were 60 Basque and Catalan child refugees in the old Grange in Street, which belonged to Clark's shoe factory. And after the Kristallnacht program in Germany in November 1938, an appeal was made on the BBC Home Service by the former Secretary, Lord Samuel, for volunteers to enrol as foster parents for the children brought to this country by the Kinder transport. And Bath was extremely generous. A meeting was held in December in the Rotary Room in the Red House. The lawyer or the barrister representing the Jewish organization came down to address them, and even before he had talked, there were some 20 offers made from families to look after a child or children, to foster them. And rather movingly, that after Christmas, the foster parents met for tea, and one foster parent is reported as saying, "We've had the happiest Christmas we can remember with the young man who was the foster child." So that's just the newspaper in the Chronicle headlining what I've just talked about. Now, inevitably, the crises awakened a fear of war, and an eminent Cambridge pacifist, Canon Raven, had this gloomy message to say, "One thing is certain, that the blow will be struck from a clear sky. The people will seek to shatter a possible enemy before the enemy has had a chance to make preparations. I very much doubt if any country will survive the first smash." Now, this led both to increased pacifism and, of course, the government circulating councils with orders to start preparing for air raids, drawing up a program for ARP, air raid precautions. And the next few slides really deal with this. You know, this was a pamphlet sent round both to private people and to organizations. This one came from the police archives in Bath. Now, this is very interesting because this is Clifford Ellis's, I mentioned Clifford Ellis as the headmaster of the Bath School, and he joined just a few days after Munich in November. He volunteered to become an air raid warden, which is very interesting. And the man who signed it is Pickard. He had experience in gas weapons, and he'd just been appointed early 1938 to organize the whole of the ARP, which I think he did relatively effectively. So now, one consequence of the war preparation, which is very interesting, is that some 2,000 men, some married, most of them young single men, came down from the distressed regions to work in the quarries around Corsham. And these quarries were used, as we can see, for the storage of ammunition. The War Office realized that their original areas, which I think were around Basingstoke, were too vulnerable to enemy bombs, and the quarries were much deeper. And these 2,000 young men, some of them with families, came down to work. Now, a lot of them were billeted in Bath, and they caused considerable social problems. And there was one scathing letter from a Welshman who was not actually part of the Corsham workers, but he had fled unemployment in Wales, and he lived near Melksham. And he was thinking of these men from the north and also from the industrial areas in South Wales. And he said, "We've reached this new freedom through an exile from our beloved Wales. We're in the midst of people who, from behind a racial barrier as impenetrable as any put up by Herr Hitler, have never known anything but security, prosperity, and economic peace, whose economic horizon has never known a cloud. Accept the fact of Bath's implacable respectability. realize the coldness of its standardized righteousness and act in Bath accordingly. Pretty scathing comment about Bathonians. I don't think entirely fair, because the mayor of Bath, Adrian Hopkins, a conservative, a far-eating conservative who was very hostile to granting Indian independence, staked his whole political career on looking after these men, ensuring they had better welfare, and he fell out with the war minister and lost the chance of standing as a parliamentary candidate for Bath. Now, really, from this point, we reach, of course, the countdown to war, and so I won't spend too long. The Munich crisis, of course. Of course, this accelerates ARP measures. That's an Anderson shelter. That's actually taken in the war in London, but these were the sort of things that you put in your garden. This is an advert for blackout curtains. And this is, of course, announcements for where you can get your baby kitted out with gas masks. And this brings one to the evacuees, that part of the preparations for war were also preparing for several thousands, probably something like 12,000 evacuees from London and Bath and the rural district. The first lot came down 1st of September and were relatively cheerful. They were met by Bath school children, and on the surface, all was jolly. The 3rd of September, another lot, mothers and children, came down, and it was reported once the mothers were told war had broken out, many of them cried. And this rather touching little picture, I think, sums up the mood, really, there. Now, this is my last picture. I'm afraid it's a terrible picture, but the point I'm trying to make is that we've turned a full circle. In 1918, we had a society mobilized for total war. 1939, we had again. And the point I'm trying to make is that local thunder, the weather forecast, that's late August 39, the forecast is local thunder, and you've got the Sergeant Major bellowing, and he is symbolizing thunder. And I just thought that sort of symbolized the militarization of society. Maybe that's a purely fancy idea, but I thought it was slightly more light-hearted cartoon to end the proceedings with. So, any questions? I've inevitably had to leave out some juicy bits because of time, because I guess none of you produced any sleeping bags, so I ought to stop here. But if you've got any questions, please.
Right, do we have any questions? Don't think there's any online. Well, I've got one which may be a bit unfair, but the Bath cabinet makers, do you know exactly what they made? I mean, were they just cabinets, industrial cabinets, or were they domestic ones?
I think in domestic tables, chairs. I think.
Okay. Yeah.
That I would not stake my life on that, but I think so, because no. I know when they struck, they were there were rumours that High Wycombe would seize the business, and I know High Wycombe made domestic furniture. Okay.
Yeah. I think that's where, was it Barker Knoll? Is there a factory in High Wycombe? Oh, it's Aircol. Aircol. Yeah, okay. Yeah. I've got a question here.
Thank you. What was the population of Bath at the end of the First World War, and did it grow in the interwar period?
I don't think it did grow. No, it slightly declined. The birth rate declined. I think it was 69,000 at the point where the caution workers come down, and they push the birth rate up, you know, by not quite several hundred babies a year, but the rate of 100 babies a year. So the birth rate does increase once they come down, sort of 36 onwards. But no, the birth rate is very static. I think if anything, it does decline.
One of your, thank you very much for your talk. One of your slides talked about the baths and those radium treatments. I've always been very fascinated by those. Was that actually radioactive treatment that was being offered at the time? You see it in the guidebooks. I've never quite
Yes, I'm
sure what it was.
interested. Yes, I don't know for sure, really. I know that I would have to look up in my book. I can't remember it, but I know that they, in the early 20s, all sorts of complex new machinery was introduced to into the baths. How much of that was radioactive? I can't remember reading those words, but you know, I'm sorry, I'm not a great help there. It's a huge topic.
I've always been fascinated by coming to the bath to be exposed to
I mean,
radiation.
they certainly, there was a big boost, sort of mid-20s under Alderman Chivers, of all sorts of new equipment.
There was lots of new equipment.
Lots
It
of,
was a selling point that you could get exposed to radiation.
I suppose it was. I haven't seen that, but I must look it up. That's interesting. Yes. But when, you know, if my publisher allows me a second edition, I must look that up.
We've got a question online about votes for women. Were there any activities relating to votes for women, presumably soon after the end of the First World War?
Well, I mean, I start really with the first election in December 18, and the electorate was, of course, it was only women over 30, but the electorate was nearly doubled, and they didn't have enough ballot boxes. They had to use empty shell cases. There's a very genteel sort of agitation in the 20s, and then when the vote, I think it's 1928, when in Parliament is passed giving flappers the vote, the Conservative MP supports it, but several members don't support it. But I haven't come across great agitations by, quote unquote, the flappers for the vote.
No, okay.
That.
I get the impression flappers were more about having a good time than actually political activity.
But certainly the MP for Bath supported it quite vigorously in 28,
Yeah.
29. But I didn't, you know, I didn't detect any particular campaigns in the city for it. Perhaps because the most vigorous ladies were all over 30. You know, the most vigorous blue stockings and
Yes.
you know, like Helen Foxcroft and people like that.
Well, I think it was more lobbying, wasn't it, after the... Am I wrong there? I mean, I think the suffragettes sort of... They stopped for the war, and I don't think they resumed their activities afterwards. I might
possibly
be wrong about
did. Not much of it is evident in Bath.
No.
But actually all other political activities and issues are evident in Bath. There were often meetings, YMCA or the Quakers, about current affairs.
Right. Do we have any more questions? Anyone in the room, or there's nobody online? So, well, I think, David, I think we've... Oh, sorry.
Person
There's a
over there.
question.
What was public transportation like in Bath during the wars? Were there trams?
Trams up to 39 and then buses. I mean, obviously the picture I showed were buses, but the trams were uprooted, I think, in 39. I think they're supposed to be buried in great pits in Combe Down, which sounds rather fun. But, and the trains, of course, you know, there were, I think, there was a station at Bathampton. One thing which I didn't sadly have time to say, that with the Munich crisis and the threat of war, there was acute anxiety amongst a lot of people about what, a replay of war. There was one unfortunate railway worker at Bathampton who threw himself in front of a train during the Munich crisis. And so there was certainly a railway station there, because he threw himself in front of whatever train it was from Bathampton to the Great Western Railway Station.
Right, I think, let me just double check, there's nothing online. No, I think we're done. Unless there's any more questions in the room, I think we'll just say, well, thank you very much, David. That was fascinating and great.